I never thought humiliation could taste so bitter, but there it was, metallic and acrid, a flavor that sat on my tongue and crawled down my throat like something I could not swallow. The restaurant's lights were soft, the kind meant to flatter skin and quiet the world outside. Tonight they only exaggerated the hollowness behind my parents' eyes. The steak on my plate had cooled into something shameful and gray-edged, the gravy congealing at the rim, yet I kept lifting my fork because manners were another armor my family wore like jewelry. You learned to chew and pretend the noise didn't mean anything, even when the noise was the sound of someone you love weaponizing your identity. Caroline leaned back in her chair with the practiced ease of someone who had always been allowed to occupy more territory than her body required. She wore the kind of smile that said she'd already rehearsed this moment, that her cruel line was the punchline of a family routine. Her hair fell in a glossy curtain that had always been admired in our neighborhood. It had been admired so much once that it became currency. "Jamie, this dinner is for real family," she said, and the phrase real family landed like a judge's gavel, not the adopted extras. Her voice wasn't loud. That was worse. It was close, conversational, the kind of insult that meant she didn't even have to raise herself to strike. Everyone heard it the way you hear a laugh track, pre-programmed acceptance. My mother covered her mouth with the back of her hand and looked away as if she'd been surprised by her own participation, though the crease at the corner of her eye said otherwise. My father, a man who taught me how to tie a tie and to hide anger behind an easy toast, raised his glass as if to honor a family joke. The clink of crystal sounded like a verdict. I sat very still and stared at the bill the waiter had set down as though it were a legal document. $3,480, a precise little rectangular accusation. It was absurd to fixate on a number while my sister had just verbally stripped me of my dignity, but numbers are where I had been raised to measure worth. Numbers were what made my father's voice smooth when he explained investments at the dinner table. Numbers were the language of my mother's quiet anxieties. For a moment I was a child again, calculating whether I could afford to buy anything that would make me less invisible. I smiled because I had been taught to smile like a reflex. Smiling is an appeasement that asks nothing but surface peace. I had planned this dinner down to the reservation time and the corner table because I believed, stubbornly, perhaps naively, that my grandmother's gift was a bridge, a currency that would finally erase the edges where I'd always fit awkwardly. My plan had been practical, a small celebration, a toast, a promise ring of sorts. I'd pictured my parents' approval on my walls like framed certificates. I imagined Caroline forced into polite gratitude. I had imagined the word family meaning what I had always desperately wanted it to mean. Instead, the air between the breadbasket and the candlelight turned viscous with a different kind of plan. I noticed with the cold clarity of someone examining a bruise after the fact, how my parents exchanged looks the way conspirators do, not quite meeting eyes, letting a small crease form at the corner of each mouth. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. That exchange told its own story. They had rehearsed this script, or at least they had rehearsed their reaction to whatever it was I was about to reveal. That small admission felt like frost, a sign that I'd misread winter as spring. Caroline's mockery was not a sudden outburst born of some drunkenness or misjudged humor. It was the product of 1,000 little investments in entitlement. She had grown up being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she was the one who carried the family forward, that her needs were more immediate, that her future was a scoreboard everyone needed to keep watching. The car she wanted at 23 had been bought with a check that had never been questioned. The study abroad program she dreamed about had been spoken about in melodramatic approval. In contrast, I had learned to measure my wants in syllables of apology and made do. That imbalance had been my childhood's curriculum. My parents' motivations were more complex than simple malice. My father clung to the image of a family whose reputation was neat, successful, respectable, unblemished by scandal. He had always made decisions designed to preserve that tableau. My mother wanted the same, but she wore hers with anxious pride, small acts of social polishing that disguised a fear of poverty, of being judged as failures. They had learned to treat money as an instrument for constructing a narrative. If an inheritance could be reframed, repurposed, or redirected to shore up that narrative, they might do it because stories had been everything to them. They had invested in keeping the house in a certain zip code, in Caroline's whims, in appearances. I had been the variable they never quite knew how to incorporate without feeling threatened by the need to explain their choices. I watched my father's hand smooth the linen napkin, the familiar motion of a man trying to fold chaos into order. Behind his smile, I imagined ledgers and missed payments, mortgage notices slipped into drawers. I imagined my mother making calls late at night and hanging up with a tight-lipped sigh that she taught me to conceal. None of these were excuses for what my sister had said. They were reasons that made their actions human, messy, and explainable, which somehow made them more dangerous. When the waiter put the bill down and the numbers glared back, I thought of how often money had been the quiet axis of our household. It had been spoken of in hushed tones, in reassurances that everything would be fine, in promises that always came with conditions. I remembered moments when I had asked for a small tuition loan and been given a lecture about responsibility, when Caroline asked for the same and was given a check. I remembered the quiet way my mother's eyes slid from me to my father and back when I spoke of future plans, a tiny, frustrated calculation that seemed to ask whether investing in me would yield adequate returns. "Excuse me," I said softly, because politeness still felt like the only language I was allowed. I thought my father said he'd take care of the check. Words hung between us like fragile glass. They wanted to be ordinary, but the air had changed. Ordinary would no longer be enough. Before my father could answer, before any of the rehearsed defenses could be deployed, a woman I did not recognize rose from near the window. She moved in a way that made my skin prickle, a confident, measured walk that suggested she'd come into the room with purpose. For a second, everything narrowed to the small, insignificant space between her and me. The murmurs of other diners, the clatter of cutlery, the low drone of background music. All of it receding until the only thing left was the sharp, premonitory sense that something I had been ignoring was about to arrive. My stomach twisted. There was the sudden sense that a curtain was being pulled back on the room. I noticed the heat of my palms against the linen, the tiny tremor in my left knee. I noticed the way Caroline's smile paused, the way my mother's hand hovered as if poised to hide something. The woman's silhouette cut a new kind of light across our table, and for the first time that evening, my breath hitched with something that was not shame but anticipation, a brittle, dangerous hope that whatever came next might finally explain the fissures I'd been tracing for years. When she reached our table, the restaurant felt suddenly too small. Every laugh and spoon clink hollowed out, leaving only the heat of the overhead lamp and the metallic tang of fear at the back of my throat. Margaret Lane was not theatrically grand. She moved like someone who had spent a lifetime in courthouses and conference rooms where nothing was allowed to be louder than a whisper. Her gray hair was cut short and practical, the kind of style that suggests a woman who has learned to be seen by what she does rather than how she looks. Her suit was a soft charcoal that swallowed the ambient light, and her hands were folded around a leather folder which she set on the table with a firmness that made the linen tremble. For a second I thought the folder might be the true weapon, paper with ink thin enough to collapse an entire family's version of itself. "Jamie?" she asked again, as if testing whether the name still belonged with me. "You don't remember me, do you?" My family went rigid. The conversation at the next table paused mid-mouthful as if gravity had chosen that instant to change. The sound of my father's wineglass striking ceramic was small and sharp, an accidental punctuation that felt like an accusation. Caroline's smirk faded into a model of polite confusion, the practiced expression of someone who has been caught mid-performance. My mother's face drained into a kind of careful whiteness. She folded her hands under her napkin the way a person hides a tremor they do not want other people to see. Margaret's voice was steady, the steadiness of someone trained to deliver unpleasant truths without the drama. "I'm Margaret Lane," she said, "your grandmother's attorney." Those words were precise, professional. They landed like a title and made the room re-evaluate itself. My grandmother's name, Evelyn, appeared in my head like a photograph. Small hands that smelled of peppermint, and the newspaper she read aloud on Sunday mornings, the habit of knitting little rectangles no one ever used. That memory pushed at me with the soft insistence of an old grief. Margaret's presence collapsed the distance between a private memory and a public fact. She turned toward my parents, and the light on her face hardened like a lens finding focus. "I've been trying to reach you for months," she said. "The transfer records didn't match your grandmother's final will." My mother's fingers found the edge of the table as if to anchor herself. "What are you doing here?" My father hissed, voice low and tight, the kind of protective noise a man makes when two private things are threatened with daylight. "This is a private dinner." Margaret did not flinch. Her refusal to be shunned to the side felt deliberate. an attorney who had chosen this stage because other channels had failed. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, using their name with clinical politeness. "If we could speak privately after dinner, I would prefer that, but I did promise your granddaughter, Jamie, that she would be told the truth here and now. There are documents that need to be seen." I watched my parents' faces change in fast, subtle increments, the smoothness of their practiced calm fraying at the edges, the old confidence that had allowed them to make unilateral decisions thinning into an anxiety I had never seen them betray before. The truth does not always require thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a series of small, unavoidable details. Margaret opened the folder and extracted a sheaf of papers clipped together. Bank statements, probate notes, a copy of the last will, and then slid beneath them like an accusation, a stamped transfer confirmation with a handwritten note of receipt, dated 3 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. "Jamie," Margaret said, meeting my eyes in a way that felt like a transaction, one human being handing another back a piece of reality. "Your grandmother left you an inheritance, $680,000 meant to help you start your life." The words should have been balm. Instead, they felt like a match struck in a dry place. 680,000, the numerals had weight. They carried a life built on their promise, tuition not yet paid, a deposit for an apartment, the quiet possibility of being allowed to breathe without making calculations every time I opened my email. The room tilted, my breath came shallow and sudden. For an instant I could only hear the sound of my own pulse. Margaret's expression shifted. Attorney precision softened into something more human, an anger like a tool measured, not cruel. "However," she continued, and the however was a hinge, "that money was transferred into your parents' joint account 3 weeks after her death. There is no record of you receiving any portion of it." The color left my mother's face at the speed of glass shattering. She made a sound, small, grazed, that was neither cry nor laugh. My father's hand tightened on his fork until the silver caught the light. He had always been a man who advised restraint but acted on impulse. I had seen him sign checks to repair reputations, to smooth over an embarrassment, to buy time. His motivation, when stripped of excuses, had often been a preservation of image. Margaret's revelation exposed a more transactional layer, a family that had chosen the continuity of its own version of prosperity over a deceased woman's explicit wishes. Caroline's mouth opened as if to find some retort, but her tongue failed her. Entitlement had not taught her what to say when the ledger of privilege was named aloud and shown to be unbalanced. She looked suddenly small, surprised by the gravity of the word "stolen," as if the concept behaved differently when attached to a family member than when it was applied to a stranger. I felt the room tilt again, not from the numbers but from what the numbers implied about trust and motive. The dossier in Margaret's hand was not only proof, it was proof of intent, a trail of signatures, timestamps, and transfers that suggested deliberation rather than mistake. The transfer confirmation bore the same neat scrawl my father used for endorsements, a familiarity that turned my stomach. "Wait," I said, the single syllable more raw than any speech I had prepared. "You mean they took it?" Margaret nodded, and that simple motion carried the weight of months of failed outreach and stubborn legal ethics. Her gaze softened for a fraction, the way a person's voice does when they consider the human cost of facts. "I'm afraid so," she said. There was no triumph in her statement, only the sober disappointment of someone who had seen justice obstructed before and had come to unstick it, one step at a time. At that moment, no one reached for the bread, no one laughed, and the wineglass condensation was the only sound that seemed innocent. The restaurant returned slowly around us. From the distance, other dinners resumed their private rhythms, but within our circle a fissure had opened and the paper in Margaret's folder was a bridge across it. Cold, bureaucratic, irreversible. I felt the small, fierce flame of an old hope. My grandmother's kindness preserved in ink, reborn into a reality that demanded reckoning. I stared at my parents as if they were strangers who had wandered into my life wearing the faces I recognized. The air between us had changed texture. It was no longer the soft, warm fabric of family dinners, but a taut, abrasive mesh that scraped at everything it touched. My father's jaw flexed as if he could clamp down on words until they became acceptable. The motion was a practiced one. Learn to keep the truth malleable. "You don't understand, Jamie," he said, the syllables a placard of justification. "We had debts. Caroline's college, the mortgage. Your grandmother would have wanted us to use it for the family." His voice carried the old cadence of someone trying to convert moral ambiguity into moral imperative. "For the family?" I repeated, and the phrase echoed like a challenge. My own voice trembled but did not break. Tremor can be its own kind of armor. "But when Caroline wanted a new car, you got it. When I needed tuition money, you said we couldn't afford it." The memory of that gulf, my father writing a check for a leased SUV while I had been handed folded promises and excuses, sat in my chest like a stone. I counted the small injustices, the pattern of selective generosity that had been explained away with soft smiles or shrugged shoulders. The ledger of our household had always been annotated in favors and omissions, and now the entries revealed themselves with an ugly clarity. My mother's face went from damask composure to a paper-thin fracture. Her voice came out small and fragile. "You were adopted, sweetheart. We thought." The word adopted fell between us like a word I had never wanted to be weaponized. It had been for me both shelter and identity, the story of being rescued, of being chosen. She used it with the casual cruelty of someone who believed labels could settle moral debt. "Don't," I interrupted, and the interruption was a clean snap. My throat burned, not just from the heat of the restaurant but from the memory of being spoken to as if my origin made me less entitled to dignity. "Don't call me sweetheart." The waiter hovered with the polite discomfort of someone positioned at the margins of a family implosion. His eyes flicked from my face to my parents' faces as if he expected instructions. Should he take the check? Should he pretend nothing monumental had been declared between courses? He had the look of a person deciding whether he would be complicit in erasing an awkwardness with a credit card swipe. My parents did not meet his gaze. Their attention was absorbed by each other and by the way we would now have to rearrange the story of ourselves. They had already started composing the narrative that would be offered to the world: mismanagement, a lapse in fiscal judgment, necessity. The script was old. They could deliver it in tones that invited sympathy. Margaret's presence at the table was both a fracture and a mirror. She had seated truth in front of us like an unadorned object: paper, ink, signatures, immutable things. "I have copies of the will," she announced, and the sentence had the unignorable authority of documentation. "If you'd like, I can help you recover what's rightfully yours." There was no flourish in her offer, only competence and a caution that suggested she knew the cost of carrying these truths forward. I could see the trained compassion in her face, the way her mouth softened as if to say she had done this work for people who would inevitably be surprised by human greed. I could not breathe. The restaurant noise pressed at the edges of my hearing, flaring and then withdrawing as if in respect. The candles on the table guttered with the small breath of air from an open vent, and their light painted my parents' features with a theatrical compassion they did not deserve. My grandmother's image, Evelyn, with her peppermint lip balm and her habit of folding the newspaper in thirds, returned in precise slices. The knot of yarn she would tuck into a basket, the smell of lemon oil she polished her silver with. Memory pressed into me like evidence. The inheritance had not been some abstract amount. It had been a promise she had made in a voice that could be tender and decisive. I remembered the last holiday with her hand resting on my knuckles while she told me plainly that she wanted me to have something that would let me stand on my own. She had written the checks in meticulous ink and had said my name with certainty. That memory had lived for years as a talisman I clung to in moments when the world felt precarious. Now, facing my parents, I felt the talisman slip and reveal what it had been covering. Not generosity, but a transaction I had been excluded from. The realization did not come with cinematic thunder. It arrived instead as a series of small, ugly facts reorganizing themselves into a pattern. A trail of bank transfers dated after her death, the recipient names that echoed slightly too familiarly with my father's signature, the absence of any record of disbursement to me. The knowledge had the cold geometry of accounting. It was precise, unemotional, and therefore damning. My father's attempts at rhetoric slid from defense to diminishment as he sought a tone that might win hearts or at least call a truce. He drew breath, considered the public theater of regret and restraint, and offered phrases he thought would shield him. "We didn't mean to. It seemed like the practical thing. Your grandmother wouldn't have wanted you to struggle." Each excuse was a small, well-rehearsed tool for deflection, calibrated to convert moral culpability into benevolent paternalism. But there is a limit to language's capacity to obscure action when documentation exists. Words could not rearrange dates and signatures. Between my mother's near sob and my father's flailing attempts at justification, Caroline cowered into silence. either because she recognized at last the real cost of their choices, or because she had been waiting for this play to end and had no lines of her own that could redeem her. Her earlier mockery retreated, replaced by a stunned smallness that had not been there before. I watched her as though through thick glass, or once I had seen a confident antagonist, I now saw a child unprepared for the ledgered consequences of adult decisions. Silence settled on the table like sifted flour. It was a heavy, charged quiet, not the neutral rest that follows conversation, but a silence filled with accusation and the weight of things that must be decided. The sound of other diners receded, the world compressed to the rectangle of our table and the documents Margaret still held. I could imagine, with a cruel clarity, the social equations my parents had preferred. Reputation plus assets equaled security. The moral arithmetic they used had a blind spot where my name should have been. I sat there and cataloged the new data of my life, facts that would not fit neatly into the private mythologies I had been told. I felt the hard, immediate weight of being used, not out of malice alone but out of choices that prioritized convenience and image over fidelity to a woman's explicit wishes. The realization was a clean, brutal certainty. The story I had been told about belonging had been conditional, negotiated, and ultimately transactional. For the first time, I understood that being saved in my family's narrative had not been an act of salvation at all, but an economic decision framed as compassion. When I tried to breathe again, the air tasted like ledger ink and lemon polish. I reached for nothing, and yet I felt every muscle tighten with a readiness I had not known I possessed. The taste of humiliation slid into something harder, a cold, precise anger that did not flare theatrically, but settled like ice in my veins. It promised vigilance, not spectacle. I would not call for retribution then. The night had not yet been assigned a course. All I had was the sharp, luminous clarity of a truth revealed, and with it, the beginning of a new map I had to learn to read alone. The next morning the city smelled of rain and paper. Margaret's office sat on the fourth floor of a building that had the kind of marble lobby meant to remind people that contracts are heavier than intentions. She ushered me past a bank of shelves lined with law books that had their own musty authority and closed the door softly behind us. The light entered in a narrow band and made the folder she set on the table look like a small lie laid out to be disproved. She slid it across with a steady hand. The thud of leather on laminate felt like the opening beat of a trial I had not known how to start. Inside were numbers that read like a confession. Bank transfers traced from my grandmother's account to various routing numbers, then rerouted into one primary account labeled in a way that suggested deliberate obfuscation, shell companies, numbered LLCs, a routing address in a jurisdiction designed to make paper disappear. There were signatures, some immaculate and identical in their slant to my father's, others that carried the fatigue of someone forging a habit into legitimacy. A forensic accountant's notes were clipped to the back, flagged transfers, timestamps that contradicted verbal accounts, a trail of withdrawals timed around bills and auto payments my parents had never explained. The packet smelled faintly of toner and lemon-scented office cleaner. The odor was so ordinary that it made the crime feel stranger, mundane, bureaucratic, domestic. "I want it back," I told Margaret. The sentence was simple and contained more than money. It contained the years of small accommodations, the tuition denials, and the polite lies. My voice was steadier than I felt because steadiness was the only armor that fit that morning. "You'll get it," she said. Her voice did not promise victory in the melodramatic sense. It promised a path steep enough that few would walk it without injury. But it might cost you your family. Her warning landed with the force of truth. I had imagined consequences, awkward Thanksgiving dinners, late-night calls full of blame. But the raw possibility of irrevocable rupture scraped my willingness thin. I thought about the laughter at the restaurant, about Caroline's smirk, about the way my parents had turned intimacy into a ledger. They had already chosen their accounting. I would have to choose mine. Margaret moved quickly. Her first motion was to assemble a team that read like a small army against Ayrshire, a forensic accountant who spoke in crisp bullet points, a paralegal whose hands moved with a cataloger's precision, and a private investigator who provided color, pictures of bank branches, dates of transfers, a record of meetings that my parents had claimed were routine. We filed a civil suit for conversion and breach of fiduciary duty. Margaret served subpoenas that read like summonses to conscience. For the first weeks, the response from my parents was silence, an avoidance that was itself an argument against culpability. If you have nothing to hide, they said with their absence, why hide? Silence, however, is a fragile strategy in court. When they finally answered, it was not with contrition but with an offer. A settlement letter arrived, a proposed repayment schedule that looked generous on paper, but contained contingencies that would ensure the money never truly reached me. A slow drip, a gag order, a demand that I sign waivers that serve the family's image more than my future. Caroline's name was oddly absent from the letter. My parents offered to correct the record publicly and to help with future needs. The letter smelled of compromise dressed up as compassion. I refused. That refusal changed the tenor of everything. Negotiation gave way to nastiness. They shifted tactics, and the language they used to vilify me worked like a kind of domestic propaganda. My parents' lawyers sent letters alleging betrayal, that I had opportunistically weaponized a private family matter for personal gain. My mother called, voice reedy with indignation, accusing me of being ungrateful and overly dramatic. Caroline posted a photo of our childhood dog on social media with a caption about family unity, an image meant to disarm the public, to suggest that I had exaggerated a dispute for attention. My inbox filled with texts from acquaintances asking if I was sure I wanted to make the family public. In depositions, they tried another tack, character assassination by ledger. My father painted me as reckless, pointing to a small unpaid credit card balance and a late rent check, as if financial ineptitude bought culpability in theft. Their counsel insinuated that perhaps my grandmother had lacked the mental clarity to write a binding will, or that the transfer was a clerical error, standard defenses practiced like a litany. They questioned timing, motive, even my capacity to appreciate money. Each insinuation was designed to recenter sympathy toward them. Each was a hand reaching to rewrite the script of who deserved what. Margaret countered with methodical force. She called in the forensic accountant to testify about the transfers, how offshore accounts had been opened under names with no business history, how a pattern of withdrawals immediately aligned with expenditures on things the family regularly enjoyed, how one particular transfer showed a small annotation in handwriting that matched my father's signature samples kept in credit union records. She subpoenaed phone records that placed my parents at the bank on the day a critical transfer was authorized. She introduced emails, carefully time-stamped, between my father and an account manager. Each piece of evidence fit into the growing mosaic of intent. The emotional burden of the fight was precise and crushing. There were days the legal timeline became my whole life. Mornings consumed by discovery requests, afternoons by depositions, evenings by the dizzying churn of fear and resolve. Friends tried to anchor me, coffee dates, an extra key offered by a college roommate, but the intimacy of betrayal isolated me in a way that sympathy could not fully bridge. My mother's calls turned from pleading to accusatory. She accused me of choosing the spectacle over compassion. My father's voice on voicemail was clipped, demanding I reconsider for the sake of reputation. Caroline avoided me in public but allowed passive-aggressive messages that dripped like slow poison into shared family circles. There were surprises, the kind that make litigation less about legalities and more about the uneven weight of truth. Margaret discovered, in a box of my grandmother's papers, a small folded note in a hand that trembled but unmistakably belonged to Evelyn. It was addressed to me and its ink had bled slightly at the fold as if someone had written with haste and tenderness. She made a quiet copy, and the copy felt like a relic smaller than its consequence. When the letter was introduced in court during evidentiary hearing, hand-delivered with the gravity of an oath, my father's composure cracked in a way words could not repair. The camera's soft click in the gallery felt like a heartbeat. He sat motionless as the judge read aloud the quiet, unequivocal line, "Jamie, you may not share my blood, but you share my heart. This gift is yours, and only yours." For the first time, he had no ledger to brandish, no accounting trick to explain away an explicit wish. His head dropped not in theatrical defeat but in the exact moment when a practice story met the stubborn immutability of ink. The courtroom did not erupt, it inhaled. I watched the color leave his face and saw, more starkly than at any dinner table, the human cost of their decisions reflected back at them. Silence proliferated like a visible thing. I felt the legal machinery as both instrument and instrumentality of truth, cold, procedural, but unequivocal. The fight was far from over, and yet in that narrow, imported light of courtroom air, a reckoning had begun. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. When the judge finally pronounced the verdict in my favor, it didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like gravity settling into place. Every cent of my inheritance, plus damages for the deceit, was to be returned. My parents' carefully curated lives, their polished veneer of respectability, suddenly had a price tag. They had to sell the house they had insisted was ours, the one that had been decorated with every ounce of Caroline's entitlement. Caroline, once so smug, now scrambled into temporary apartments with friends, the smugness replaced by uncertainty. But I didn't celebrate. Not in the way movies would have scripted it. Winning didn't erase the years of humiliation. The nights spent lying awake replaying Caroline's words, my parents' laughter echoing in my ears. Justice had a taste, but it was bitter, complicated, half relief, half mourning. The victory was a ledger entry, a number in an account somewhere, a symbolic restitution, but the betrayal lingered, lodged in memory, a rawness that no legal triumph could erase. Months passed. Life had a way of forcing quiet reflection in the gaps left by shattered relationships. I found myself walking past the familiar streets of the city, past the corner where my grandmother used to take me for ice cream when no one else would notice I needed comfort. I thought about the dinners, the bills, the invisible accounting of worth my parents had imposed on me. And then, almost unconsciously, I found myself in the restaurant where it had all exploded, the place where Caroline's smirk had cut deeper than any blade. I walked in alone. The host recognized me, gave a polite nod, but did not prod with recognition. The same table near the window, the one with the golden light that had glinted off Caroline's smug expression, now seemed ordinary, unmarked by the memory of insult. I ordered the meal I had once shared in shame, a perfectly cooked steak, mashed potatoes whipped to a creamy perfection, a glass of deep red wine. The plate arrived, its aroma rich and unthreatening, a quiet contrast to the chaos of the night it had once accompanied. When the check came, I examined it. The total, much like the night before the battle began, was a shock, though not unbearable. The waiter lingered, a hint of unease in his expression. "Would you like me to split the check?" he asked, uncertain, almost deferential. "No," I said softly, with a calm that surprised even me. "I've got it." I paid the bill, and it was more than a transaction. It was reclamation. Each bill paid was a claim to my own space, my own dignity. The money was meaningless in comparison to what it symbolized, a closure, a reckoning with the past, a statement that I would define my own worth. The waiter's eyes softened, a subtle acknowledgement of the invisible weight lifted. I left the cash and walked away slowly, savoring the sense of control that had once seemed forever beyond reach. As I stood to leave, I noticed Margaret in the corner, seated quietly with a glass of water, watching me. She raised her glass, a silent toast, and I returned it with a slow, deliberate lift of mine. We didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. She understood, as did I, that this moment was far larger than legal victories or financial restitution. It was about recognition, about the reclamation of identity, about the survival of self in the face of orchestrated erasure. That night, I felt something shift inside me. The title my sister had flung at me, the casual cruelty of being called just the adopted one, lost its sting. I wasn't just anything. I was the sum of my choices, my endurance, my willingness to see injustice and face it. The betrayal had been cruel, yes, but it had forced me to confront something even deeper. The necessity of defining family, not by shared blood, but by those who stand with you when the stakes are highest, when the bills, literal and metaphorical, come due. I walked out into the cool evening air, the city's hum surrounding me. There was a clarity that had been absent for years. The weight of their deception no longer pressed me to the floor. I could feel the pulse of my own independence, steady, unyielding, real. The road ahead was mine to navigate, unshaped by their judgments, unshadowed by their selfishness. Sometimes betrayal leaves scars. Sometimes it leaves ash. But sometimes, if you endure, it leaves a foundation, a raw, solid ground on which to build yourself anew. That night, I realized that the cruelest betrayal had given me the clearest view of my own strength. I became my own person, not defined by the people who had failed me, but by the resilience I had discovered in myself. And as I stepped into the quiet glow of the city lights, I understood fully, family isn't who claims you or raises you. It's who stands beside you, unwavering when every account is tallied and every bill finally comes due. And in that understanding, I was whole.